Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born October 21st, 1772, the youngest of 10 children. He had 1 sister and 8 brothers. He also had 4 older stepsisters from his father's first marriage. By the time of Samuel's birth, his father, John Coleridge, aged 53, was headmaster of the King's School at Ottery St Mary in Devon and vicar of the parish church. In spite of these prestigious occupations, John was poor. In regard to John's character, he was eccentric, naive, and benevolent. He once appeared before the bishop with a shaven head, having forgotten to put on his wig. While dining at a neighbour's, he accidentally stuffed a female friend's apron down his trousers, thinking he was tucking in his own shirt. Samuel's mother, Anne, was a distant and cold woman. When writing letters home, Samuel and his brothers would send their love to their siblings and their duty to their mother. Samuel, barely 8 years old, exuded sensibility, imagination, vanity, sloth, and feelings of deep and bitter contempt for almost all who traversed the orbit of his understanding. To escape his oppressive childhood, he took refuge in books such as The Arabian Nights, Robinson Crusoe, and Roderick Random. On one account, the escape was literal. As Samuel recalled,
"I had asked my mother one evening to cut my cheese entire so that I might toast it. This was no easy matter, it being a crumbly cheese. My mother, however, did it. I went into the garden for something or other, and in the meantime my brother Frank minced my cheese. I returned, saw the exploit, and in an agony of passion flew at Frank. He pretended to have been seriously hurt by my blow, flung himself on the ground, and there lay with outstretched limbs. I hung over him, moaning and in great fright. He leapt up and with a hoarse laugh gave me a severe blow to the face. I seized a knife and was running at him when my mother came in and took me by the arm. I expected a flogging, and struggling from her, I ran away to a hill at the bottom of which the Otter flows, about 1 mile from Ottery."
When his rage died down, Samuel recited his evening prayers, inwardly satisfied at how miserable his mother must be. A search party was sent out. Sir Stafford Northcote, a family friend, heard Samuel crying and delivered him to his loving father. Tears were in John's eyes. In October 1781, when Samuel was 9, John suddenly died. Of his father, Samuel wrote,
"I read every book that came in my way, and my father was fond of me and used to take me on his knee and hold long conversations with me. He told me the names of the stars and how Jupiter was 1,000 times larger than our world, and that the other twinkling stars were suns that had worlds rolling around them. My mind had been habituated to the vast, and I never regarded my senses in any way as the criteria of my belief."
In other words, young Samuel could believe without seeing, due in part to his imagination. By the time of John's death, Samuel's brother John was already in the army, based in India. He took on the role of protector, including protector of Samuel, whom John had never seen. John ended up dying in 1787 while suffering from malaria and depression. Brother William became a schoolmaster and clergyman and died at age 23. James became a lieutenant colonel in 1807. Edward lived a long life, marrying a woman 20 years older than his mother. George succeeded his father as clergyman and headmaster of the King's School at Ottery. Frank joined John in the Indian Army and grew feverish prior to the siege of Seringapatam and committed suicide. Luke became a doctor and died at age 24. One brother died in infancy, and Samuel's sister, Anne, nicknamed Nancy, died in 1791 at age 24, the same age as Luke. Samuel's brother John sent money home and would write James to prevent Nancy from becoming a milliner, a job associated in the public mind with prostitution. But John's income could not supplement his deceased father's. The Coleridges moved out of the large schoolhouse and into the warden's house nearby. A few months later, Samuel was sent for by a former pupil of his father's, Judge Buller, who arranged for him to attend Christ's Hospital School near London, an institution founded to educate the sons of poor gentry. Samuel and the family felt degraded. His brothers were ashamed to have Samuel visit in his school uniform. Judge Buller, too, was so snobbish in the matter, Samuel stopped visiting him as well. Samuel was a lonely, sensitive prodigy. His studies began in 1782 and lasted for 9 years, in a school associated with poverty and originally conceived for orphans. The headmaster, Reverend James Boyer, was an ardent flogger and petty tyrant that criticized his students' verse harshly, calling it stuff. Christ's Hospital was divided into 5 departments: grammar, math, writing, reading, and drawing. Of the grammar school, the top scholars were known as Grecians. The precocious Samuel became a Grecian. His uncle would take him to coffee houses and taverns, where Samuel's ability to hold large parties in thrall by his conversation was readily apparent. Samuel only returned 3 or 4 times to Ottery while away at school, and would spend most holidays moping around London, lost in daydreams. Sometimes, in letters, he would present himself in a slightly mocking way, in order to preempt criticism he expected from others. In his last year, he met Tom Evans. Tom had 3 sisters that all happened to work in a milliner's shop, of which the oldest, Mary, Samuel fell in love with. The love was more sentimental than passionate. Mary did not fully reciprocate, but the visits were still enjoyable. Mrs. Evans was more motherly to Samuel than his own mother. Samuel also spent half the time in the sick ward of the school, afflicted with jaundice and rheumatic fever brought on by swimming fully dressed in the New River and keeping his wet clothes on afterward. He was prescribed laudanum to relieve fever. Laudanum is made up of extracts of opium mixed with alcohol and was widely prescribed for a variety of complaints today treated with aspirin and analgesics. On the literary front, Samuel's juvenile poetry while at school gave little foretaste of what was to come. His early poems were composite imitations of Milton, Gray, and Thomson, and his nouns too often were paired with attendant adjectives, according to his teacher: feathered songsters, meek-eyed power, wildly working visions. The adjectives had to be dropped. Boyer's advice was sensible, though Samuel was slow to follow it. In 1791, Samuel enrolled in Jesus College, Cambridge, on a Christ's Hospital scholarship. Here, he wrote his brother George many letters complaining of a lack of money. When Samuel attended lectures, his classmates would constantly cut off the tail of his gown, until one day he was accosted by the Master of Jesus while crossing the quadrangle.
Mr. Coleridge, will you please get rid of that shameful gown?
Why, sir, I think I've got rid of the greatest part of it already.
In 1792, Samuel won the Brown Gold Medal for his Greek Sapphic ode condemning the slave trade. A bill calling for the abolition of the slave trade failed in Parliament that year. Anyone in British society that had long agitated for the reform of Parliament, the abolition of restrictions on Catholics, and the abolition of the slave trade found themselves labelled Jacobins. Thomas Paine, who published the second part of his Republican work, The Rights of Man, was outlawed. He'd already left England for France, where he was treated as a hero until he opposed the execution of King Louis XVI and was subsequently arrested. Samuel became increasingly radical during his Cambridge years. He also indulged in prostitutes and spent the first summer visiting Ottery. During vacation, Samuel accompanied a party of young ladies to a cave near Ottery, known locally as the Pixie's Parlour. Here, he and his brothers had once cut their initials into the rock as children. Now a young man, Samuel wrote a sentimental ode, Songs of the Pixies. The ode leads up to a climax in which one of the young ladies is declared Fairy Queen. However, its high point is the fourth stanza, where Samuel fancies himself as a youthful bard, soon to be crowned with the laurel wreath. Samuel had poetic aspirations, but he was heavily in debt, and so fearful of the reaction of his older brothers that he left Cambridge for London in November 1793, to sink his last cash in a ticket in the Irish lottery. He lost. On the brink of suicide and in a rash act of despair, in February 1794, he enlisted in the army. To illustrate the direness of Samuel's impulse, Britain was at war with France. A soldier could not leave the army unless they were bought out of it, and Samuel was an anti-Pitt, anti-Tory liberal. Silas Tomkin Cumberbatch, his new self-appointed alias of the 15th Light Dragoons, was a poor horseman. He would ask his fellow soldiers for help grooming his horse in exchange for writing letters to their wives on their behalf. Soon, he was marched to Henley, where he was ordered to nurse a soldier with smallpox back to health. Ever the talker, Samuel had told some of his friends that he enlisted. One of them, J.L. Tuckett, wasted no time in telling George Coleridge his brother Samuel's whereabouts. George wrote calming letters to Samuel and urgent letters to their brother James to arrange the emancipation. The army was open to the idea, but demanded a substitute, and meanwhile reassigned Samuel to High Wycombe, where he was ordered to tend a baggage cart. In Reading, an Ottery man paid Samuel a visit with information to behave with great delicacy. Within 3 months of joining, the demand for a substitute was waived. Silas Tomkin Cumberbatch was discharged as insane. The Fellows of Jesus College let him off with a reprimand. By June, Samuel set out with a travelling companion, Joseph Hucks, on a pedestrian tour of Wales. They were to stop at Oxford on the way to pay a visit to an old Christ's Hospital friend, Robert Allen. Robert Allen introduced Samuel to Robert Southey. Southey, who was 2 years younger than Samuel and a student at Balliol College, released in him a whirlwind of energy and emotion and poetical and political ideas. Southey had been born in Bristol, the son of a linen draper, and was sent to Westminster School. There, he published a magazine in protest of teachers flogging students, which he titled The Flagellant. The stunt got him expelled. At Balliol, Southey read William Godwin's recently published Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and adopted Godwin's views on the depravity of society, the iniquity of private property, and the hypocrisy of the judicial system. Southey's father died in 1790 in debtor's prison, forcing his mother to open a lodging house in Bath to make ends meet. Southey provided Samuel an outlet to express his rebellious nature, and, together, they contemplated emigrating to the Susquehanna River Valley in the United States to form a utopia they called the Pantisocracy. After the walking tours of Wales, Samuel went walking with Southey to Bath, Wells, and the Cheddar Gorge, chatting about philosophy the whole way like two poets. They also visited the Somerset village of Netherstowey, where they were received by Tom Poole, a wealthy tanner, local philanthropist, and notorious Democrat. In May 1794, Prime Minister William Pitt suspended habeas corpus because of an alleged seditious plot by the London Constitutional Society and the London Corresponding Society. Reformist pamphlets were suppressed, publishers and booksellers prosecuted. It's in this background that Southey and Coleridge dreamed of pantisocracy, choosing not to become clergymen or enter law. Their new society would include themselves, friends, Southey's mother, the Fricker sisters, and their spouses. Mr. Fricker was a wine merchant in Bristol who had died, leaving behind his wife and 6 surviving children: Sara, Mary, Edith, Martha, Elizabeth, and George. Robert Southey was engaged to Edith. After 5 weeks with Southey, Samuel went to London and ultimately dropped out of Cambridge. In December 1794, Samuel met Thomas Holcroft, a playwright and actor who'd spent that summer locked up in the Tower of London on charges of high treason. The court found there was no case and had him released. Now free, Holcroft introduced Samuel Coleridge to William Godwin. Samuel agreed with their political views, but disagreed over religion. Holcroft and Godwin were atheists. The eloquent Coleridge held his Christian ground and won the arguments against both of them, and eventually, by Godwin's own admission, converted Godwin to a form of theism. Samuel penned a number of sonnets, one praising Godwin for his radicalism, and another attacking Pitt head-on, despite the continued suspension of habeas corpus. All were published in the Morning Chronicle. Meanwhile, Southey impatiently awaited Samuel's arrival in Bath, hoping he'd marry Sara Fricker, the eldest of the Fricker sisters. Samuel self-medicated with opium and, in a state of guilt and giddiness, dreaded a meeting with Sara. By mid-January 1795, the pair were brought into contact again. Samuel was pleasantly surprised to learn she had recently rejected 2 suitors, including one with a large fortune, and was open to the possibility of marriage. In Bristol, Samuel lectured against the slave trade, William Pitt, and war with France, using scripture to back up his arguments. He also found a publisher for his poetry, Joseph Cottle. Cottle was a young bookseller with pretensions to be a poet himself, and had a spirit of generosity towards other aspiring authors. By mid-year, William Pitt implemented a powder tax to finance his war with Napoleon. Those in opposition, like Coleridge and Poole, simply stopped powdering their wigs. By year's end, Pitt introduced 2 more bills, known as the Gagging Acts, that would restrict freedom of speech even further, by extending the meaning of treason far beyond just plotting against the king's life, and limit gatherings to less than 50 people. In November, Samuel boldly gave a lecture attacking the bills, then published his argument in a pamphlet before they became law, which they did. While lecturing, Samuel would appear slovenly, in need of hair combing and fresh stockings, but he left his audience spellbound. When a group of gentlemen of the opposite party hissed at him, Samuel replied,
I am not at all surprised when the hot prejudices of aristocrats are suddenly plunged into the cool water of reason that they should go off with a hiss.
Samuel dressed nicely for his portrait that year, painted by Peter Van Dyck in Bristol. It was in 1795 that Samuel and Southey had a falling out. Southey's uncle Herbert proposed a job for him as a clergyman. Southey hesitated, though declined. Then Uncle Herbert proposed Southey come with him to Portugal for a few months, then go to London to train as a lawyer. Southey accepted and married Edith Fricker. The pantisocracy was abandoned and a rift between he and Samuel was formed. Over the summer, Samuel found a cottage at Clevedon overlooking the Bristol Channel that would become his first married home. He mentioned it in a verse titled The Aeolian Harp.
My pensive Sara, thy soft cheek reclined thus on mine arm, most soothing sweet it is to sit beside our cot, our cot o'ergrown with white-flowered jasmine and the broad-leaved myrtle.
The couple was wed on October 4th, 1795, in Poor Chatterton's Church, St Mary Redcliffe, Bristol. In September, a month prior, another important union began. Coleridge and Southey were introduced to William Wordsworth. A certain John and Azaria Pinney, sons of a wealthy Bristol merchant, had offered Wordsworth free use of a house in Dorset called Racedown Lodge, and Wordsworth was in Bristol preparing to receive it. Wordsworth was less charming and brilliant in company than Coleridge, but confident in his genius. Wordsworth reported that,
"Coleridge was at Bristol part of the time I was there. I saw but little of him. I wished indeed to have seen more. His talent appears to me very great."
Samuel at this time had the greater reputation. He settled into married life by publishing a periodical called The Watchman, to be financed by subscription, and set off on a tour of the provinces in search of subscribers, preaching at chapels along the way. When he returned in February 1796, Sara was living with her mother on Redcliffe Hill, Bristol. The cottage had been too far from the city. The Watchman, which had 10 issues, proved unsuccessful and too bantering. Without money, Samuel found himself responsible not only for his now pregnant Sara, but also for her mother, brother, and George Burnet, an opium-addicted relic of the Pantisocracy scheme. It's at this time Cottle brought out Coleridge's first volume of poetry, poems on various subjects. It received polite reviews, but Samuel still needed a steady income. He made an arrangement to tutor and lodge Charles Lloyd, a poetically inclined son of a rich Quaker family, for £80 a year. Samuel was in Birmingham, gaining the approval of Lloyd's father, when he received a letter that Sara had given birth to a son 3 weeks early. Samuel hurried home, taking Charles Lloyd with him. Samuel and Sara named the boy David Hartley Coleridge, after the 18th century philosopher. In May 1796, Charles Lamb reappeared in Samuel's life. He'd been a classmate at Christ's Hospital and was recently out of the madhouse at Hoxton. He was employed as a clerk at the East India Trading Company and recently paid a debt Samuel had owed to the pub's landlord. Unfortunately, Lamb's hereditary insanity also affected his beloved sister Mary. In September, Lamb wrote Samuel of the gruesome incident that took place. Mary, in a fit of insanity during a heated argument, stabbed her mother to death in the kitchen of their home. Lamb had run into the house and snatched the knife from Mary before she could cause any more harm. Their aunt and senile father were also present. Lamb brought Mary to a madhouse and appealed to Samuel for a religious letter to bolster his faith. Lamb and Coleridge both being Unitarian. Lamb encouraged Samuel to keep writing poetry, to cultivate simplicity and banish elaborateness. Charles Lamb perceived Samuel's powers, but felt obliged to lecture him on their proper use. Samuel also corresponded with Wordsworth and John Thelwell, another quote-unquote seditionist who was locked in the Tower of London with Holcroft and released. Tomple wrote, inviting Samuel to live in a small house in Nether Stowey at the bottom of his garden. Samuel agreed on the offer. A gutter ran past the front door. There was an infestation of mice and the smell of feces from the tannery. But to Samuel, the cottage represented true happiness. Then, out of nowhere, Samuel sent Poole an excitable letter about how he was seized by an intolerable pain from
my right temple to the tip of my right shoulder. I was nearly frantic and ran about the house naked, endeavoring by every means to excite sensations. The pain returned, and I took between 60 and 70 drops of laudanum and sopped the Cerberus just as his mouth began to open. Giant fiend of 100 hands. With a shower of arrowy death pangs he transpierced me, and then he became a wolf and lay gnawing at my bones.
Paul had second thoughts about allowing Samuel live so close to him. But Samuel wrote, apologizing for his flighty letter and that he was under the immediate inspiration of laudanum. The Coleridges and Charles Lloyd moved in. Southey soon arrived back in Bristol and bore Samuel's insults in the name of reconciliation, though their friendship was greatly damaged. Samuel began work on his second volume of poetry. In April 1797, Wordsworth was in Bristol, on his way back to Racedown, and visited Samuel at Nether Stowey. Samuel was in a state of depression, and his spirits lifted instantly. In June, Samuel returned the visit and saw Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy at Racedown, and brought with him 2.5 acts of Osorio, a play he'd been commissioned to write for the London Theatre. Samuel did not keep to the high road, but leapt over a gate and bounded down the pathless field, by which he cut off an angle. Dorothy described Samuel to a friend, Mary Hutchinson, like this.
You had a great loss in not seeing Coleridge. He is a wonderful man. His conversation teems with soul, mind, and spirit. At first, I thought him very plain. That is, for about 3 minutes. He is pale and thin. He has a wide mouth, thick lips, and not very good teeth. Longish, loose, growing, half-curling, rough black hair. But if you hear him speak, for 5 minutes you think no more of them. His eye is large and full, not dark but grey. Such an eye as would receive from a heavy soul the dullest expression. But it speaks every emotion of his animated mind. It has more of the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling than I have ever witnessed.
It turned out that Wordsworth was writing a play too, The Borderers, with echoes of Shakespeare, just like Coleridge's Osorio. They also shared the same publisher, Joseph Cottle. After 2 weeks at Racedown, Samuel brought Wordsworth and Dorothy with him to Nether Stowey. They succumbed to Samuel's charms and surrendered themselves to the delights of the countryside around Stowey, and even found a big house for let nearby called Alfoxden. Samuel described his new neighbour, Dorothy, like this.
Her manners are simple, ardent, impressive. Her information various, her eye watchful in minutest observation of nature, and her taste a perfect electrometer.
Samuel invited Charles Lamb to visit, whereby Lamb observed that Samuel's attention was focused on Wordsworth. One day, Sara accidentally spilled boiling milk onto Samuel's foot, forcing him to stay behind while the others went on a walk. His missing out resulted in the poem This Lime Tree Bower My Prison. In the poem, Samuel's attitude moves from the fear of missing out to realizing the immediate beauty that surrounds him. The bower is no longer a prison, but something to be enjoyed. Lamb had no sooner returned to London than John Thelwell arrived as a guest of the Coleridges. Landlords had refused Thelwell speak in public rooms for fear of prosecution due to the gagging acts, leading Thelwell to seek a rural retreat. Samuel thought Thelwell a very warm-hearted and honest man. Thelwell, in return, was seduced by the notion of himself, Coleridge and Wordsworth as a literary and political triumvirate, able to burst forth in poetical flights of enthusiasm and to philosophize on the joys of tranquil country life which the residents of cities can never know.
Citizen John,
Samuel called in the garden.
This is a fine place to talk treason in.
Nay, Citizen Samuel,
He replied.
It is a place to make a man forget that there is any necessity for treason.
By August 1797, Coleridge and Wordsworth were under government surveillance. Earlier in February, a small French expeditionary force had landed near Fishguard on the Pembrokeshire coast. The soldiers were overpowered and taken prisoner, but the incident left a frisson of alarm in the region. Coleridge and Wordsworth who typically strolled the coastline with notebooks and pencils, were highly suspicious, not to mention their radical viewpoints. An informant had misidentified Wordsworth and Dorothy as foreigners due to their suntans and North Country accents, leading a James Walsh at the Home Office to spy on them. The sight of Thelwell aroused further suspicion, as Walsh had formerly been assigned to spy on Thelwell in London. When Thelwell left, Poole calmed the villagers, vouching for Mr. Wordsworth and Mr. Coleridge, and Samuel urged Thelwell not to settle in Stowey because of the discord his presence caused. Thelwell obeyed, and local tensions were relieved. Samuel, Wordsworth and Dorothy spent the summer rambling among the combes of the Quantock Hills and the Somerset and Devon coastlines. Sara Coleridge was too busy looking after Hartley to join them. On at least one occasion in October, Samuel walked alone in this isolated region on the North Somerset-Devon border. His solitary walk resulted in Kubla Khan, one of the most famous poems in the English language. According to Coleridge,
This fragment, with a good deal more not recoverable, was composed in a sort of reverie, brought on by 2 grains of opium, taken to check a dysentery, at a farmhouse between Porlock and Linton, a quarter of a mile from Culbourne Church, in the fall of the year 1797.
the farmhouse has been identified as Ash Farm, above Culbourne Coombe. The subject of Kubla Khan was from the book he fell asleep reading, called Pilgrimage, by Samuel Purchas. When Coleridge awoke, he wrote the poem and claimed he was interrupted by a man from Porlock on business and so could not finish. Much can be said about Kubla Khan, mainly that it's a description of the creative process. The poem describes how Emperor Kubla Khan created a palace in a place that Coleridge called Xanadu, encircled by a wall. The creation of the palace is a metaphor that conveys the turbulent processes that often underlie creative activity.
In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery.
It begins with lines that create a sense of power, grace, and delight, but also holiness, infinity, and darkness.
But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill, athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath the waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, and mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain in the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice.
The middle lines of the poem describe the actual act of creation as a violent and energetic natural process that seems almost beyond human control. These lines also convey the risks and threats that the creative person must face. The ancestral voices prophesying war.
A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise.
The poem's concluding lines suggest that creation, be it of a stately pleasure dome or a piece of verse, is a complex and awe-inspiring process that contains elements of delight, but also fear, holiness, and mystical inspiration. It can lead to a sunny pleasure dome and, paradoxically, simultaneously, caves of ice, either external or internal. In short, the poem taps into the divine, no matter the consequences or credits. By December, Samuel's play Osorio had been rejected, as had Wordsworth's The Borderers. Samuel now formulated a plan to go to Germany. He also was at work on a ballad. According to Dorothy,
William and Coleridge had, on a recent walk to the coast, employed themselves in laying the plan of a ballad to be published with some pieces of William's.
funding a trip to Germany seemed implausible, as Samuel could not support himself. Poole and his friends had collected 20 guineas for Samuel, but it wasn't enough. He owed the printer Biggs, his shoemaker, his coal merchant, the chandler, a quarter's rent, the maid's wages, and Mrs. Fricker's quarterly 5 guineas. In dire straits, Samuel was offered an engagement at the vacant ministry at Shrewsbury, and preached there while thinking about officially accepting the position. Seated in the congregation was the 19-year-old William Hazlitt, future essayist and critic. Hazlitt described the lecture like this.
And for myself, I could not have been more delighted if I had heard the music of the spheres. Poetry and philosophy had met together. Truth and genius had embraced. Under the eye and with the sanction of religion, this was even beyond my hopes. I returned home well satisfied.
Before Samuel formally accepted the position of minister, Tom and John Wedgwood, sons of the famous Staffordshire potter, Josiah Wedgwood, who had died in 1795, leaving his 3 sons wealthy, paid a visit to Wordsworth at Alfoxden. Tom, later known as the first photographer, and his other brother Josiah, wrote Samuel, offering him a £150 annuity for life, in hopes of saving him from the pulpit. The ministry's lack for poetry's gain. The offer filled Samuel with the dread of not living up to the payment, but ultimately he accepted. In May 1798, Samuel and Wordsworth discussed with Cottle a joint publication of their poems. Originally, they had wanted to write 3 cantos titled The Wanderings of Cain, but when the idea fell apart, they turned their attention to ballads. At the front of the collaboration would be Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. The poem is about a mariner retelling his story at a wedding about a sea voyage he took whereby he shot an albatross, an action that brought disaster on him and his crew. Poetically, it's an expression of the problem of human guilt. Samuel wrote of his view of guilt and sin to his brother George.
I believe most steadfastly in original sin, that from our mother's womb our understandings are darkened, and even where our understandings are in the light, that our organization is depraved and our volitions imperfect, and we sometimes see the good without wishing to attain it, and oftener wish it without the energy that wills and performs.
Notably, this paralysis of the will is also an effect of taking opium. For this and many reasons, Coleridge came to associate himself with his own creation, the Ancient Mariner. And he accomplished the poem with realistic detail of sea travel without ever having been on the ocean. The poem's creation was owed to his wide reading and extreme sensitivity, drawing on written accounts of sea travel, Shakespeare, Milton, the biblical Cain, Fletcher Christian's guilt for his mutiny on the Bounty, the arbitrary punishments in the Arabian Nights, and Coleridge's own nightmares. The shooting of the bird, the mariner's physical description, and the ship being crewed by dead men was all suggested by Wordsworth. Samuel finished the poem in March 1798 and took it to Alfoxden to show Wordsworth and Dorothy, seeing as Samuel and Wordsworth often wrote at the same table. Another well-known poem, Frost at Midnight, was written in February. The poem is about Samuel deep in thought in his cottage, while Hartley is asleep in a cradle beside him. Everything is quiet on this winter's night, but the fire makes noise. Samuel thinks back to his school days in the city and is glad that Hartley will be surrounded by nature. To have a close relationship with nature is to be close to God. Samuel details the values of each season and, because he encourages nature and God for his son, believes Hartley will recognize it too when he's older. Frost at Midnight did not appear in the new collection, but another conversation poem did, The Nightingale, in which Coleridge addressed Wordsworth and Dorothy and twisted the poetic tradition of the bird from something melancholy to something pleasant. As to Coleridge, nothing in nature is melancholy. In May, Samuel's son Berkeley was born, named after a philosopher like Hartley. Meanwhile, Cottle offered to publish the collection of poems by Coleridge and Wordsworth. Samuel wanted the volume to appear anonymously, and Wordsworth did not want to publish alone. However, while Wordsworth took great care in the presentation of his poems, Coleridge had a fatal carelessness and offhand attitude towards his work. The title of the volume was to be Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth's poems were tales of country people suffering and enduring at a time of great change and danger from industrialization. Coleridge's were more diverse, often including the supernatural. Coleridge and Wordsworth did not wait to see how their volume would be received. By September, they had set off for Germany, along with Dorothy and a stowy friend named John Chester, that hung off Coleridge's every word. For good reason. Coleridge won the hearts of all he met. Originally, he and Wordsworth had planned to go to Weimar and meet Goethe, Wieland and Herder, but they thought it too expensive. The group split up. Samuel and Chester went to Ratzeburg, and the Wordsworth, deeming Ratzeburg too expensive, went to cheaper lodgings in Goslar in the Harz Mountains. While Coleridge played with verse and studied German literature, Wordsworth got down to work, writing beautiful poetry in English. Samuel missed William and Dorothy in Goslar and his family back home. On November 1st, 1798, Sara wrote Samuel a troubling letter.
About 3 weeks after you left Stowey, Mrs. R. Poole proposed to inoculate her child and sent round to the inhabitants. On Saturday, her child was inoculated, and ours, and several others. My dear baby Berkeley, on the 8th day, began to droop. On the 9th, he was very ill, and on the 10th, the pustules began to appear on the skin by hundreds. He lay upon my lap like a dead child, burning like fire, and all over he was as red as scarlet.
Poole wrote to Coleridge on November the 22nd, speaking cheerfully, not wanting to upset him. Vaccination for smallpox was a recent invention. Edward Jenner, having first inoculated a patient with the cowpox virus in 1796, and it was therefore, as Sara showed in her first letter to Coleridge, a matter of doubt and difficulty to decide whether to vaccinate or not. On February the 11th, the child died of convulsions. Sara and Hartley moved in with Southey and Edith. Poole urged Sara to spare Coleridge the news, knowing disagreeable subjects had a violent effect on him, yet she yearned for consolation. In the end, Poole knew he must tell his friend. He wrote Coleridge on March the 15th, and Sara wrote to Coleridge on March the 25th. All letters took a month to arrive. Sara's pleading led Coleridge to delay his return and complete a course of study at Göttingen. His response to trouble was to seek to avoid it. He returned in July. Wordsworth had arrived back in May and learned that sales of lyrical ballads were slow and reviews disappointing. He formed the impression that The Ancient Mariner was an injury to the volume. Many reviewers thought the whole work was penned by Coleridge. And even though Robert Southey knew some of it was Wordsworth's, he still spoke negatively in the critical review. The irony is that Southey at this time wrote his own ballad about seafaring and was directly influenced by The Ancient Mariner, and it was a pale imitation at best. Instead of upbraiding Southey, however, Coleridge buried the hatchet. Southey had supported Sara and Hartley in the wake of Berkeley's death. The two men made up, for the time being, and actively participated in experiments taking place at Beddoes Pneumatic Institution, which had opened in Clifton in 1799. The brilliant young man who managed it was the 20-year-old Humphrey Davy. Davy nearly killed himself once or twice experimenting with carbon monoxide. He'd been known sometimes to breathe a deadly gas, with his finger on his pulse, to determine how much could be borne, before a serious declension occurred in the vital action. In April 1799, Davy succeeded in discovering what Southey called the wonder-working gaseous oxide of azote, otherwise known as nitrous oxide, or more colloquially, laughing gas. Southey, the Wedgwoods, George Burnett, and of course Coleridge queued up to join the experiment. Coleridge described the effect.
The first time I inspired the nitrous oxide, I felt an highly pleasurable sensation of warmth over my whole frame, resembling that which I remember once to have experienced after returning from a walk in the snow into a warm room. The only motion which I felt inclined to make was that of laughing at those who were looking at me. My eyes felt distended, and towards the last my heart beat as if it were leaping up and down. On removing the mouthpiece, the whole sensation went off almost instantly.
Coleridge and Davy were kindred spirits, as Davy was also a poet, an inveterate jotter of miscellanea in notebooks, and given to drug-assisted dreams and visions. When Coleridge and Tom Wedgwood wanted to try Indian hemp to relieve their ailments, they turned to Davy to supply it. Cracks began to show in Samuel and Sara's marriage. While she and Hartley spent time with friends near Watchet, Samuel and Cottle visited Wordsworth in Sockburn. Wordsworth took Samuel on a tour of the lakes and introduced him to Sara Hutchinson, a woman that Samuel developed feelings for. Wordsworth wed Sara's sister, Mary Hutchinson, while Sara was to suffer from Coleridge's hopeless and sometimes importunate feelings. In 1800, Coleridge moved to London with his family and got a job as a parliamentary reporter for the Morning Post. His articles attacked Pitt and showed optimism toward Napoleon's desire for peace. The Coleridges spent Christmas with William Godwin at Somerstown, where Samuel noticed how oppressed-looking Godwin's children were. These were 3-year-old Mary, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who had died soon after giving birth to her in 1797, and Fanny, the 5-year-old daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft's affair with Gilbert Imlay. Mary was to later write the novel Frankenstein, inspired after hearing Lord Byron read Coleridge's poem Christabel. Sara Coleridge, now pregnant, returned to Stowey while Samuel stayed on in London. He was translating the 3 parts of Schiller's historical drama Wallenstein by day and drinking with Godwin and Lamb by night. In April, Samuel went north and sent for Sara and Hartley. By July, they moved into a large house, Greta Hall, on a hill just outside Keswick, where Sara eventually gave birth to their son Derwent, named after one of the lakes. The Coleridges often went on walks through the beautiful landscapes, Samuel frequently walking alone to Grasmere, 13 miles away, to see the Wordsworths. Samuel owed articles, poems, and projects from his time in Germany, but sat down instead to help with Wordsworth's second edition of Lyrical Ballads. By June 1800, the first edition had unexpectedly sold out. Wordsworth had bandied the idea back and forth not to include the Ancient Mariner, and decided to leave it in, but having Coleridge modernise the spelling. Meanwhile, Coleridge worked on part 2 of his Gothic narrative poem, Christabel. He'd finished part 1 in 1797. The poem concerns Christabel, who goes into the woods to pray by a large oak tree and hears a strange noise. Upon looking behind the tree, she finds Geraldine, who says that she has been abducted from her home by men on horseback. Christabel pities Geraldine and takes her home with her. However, supernatural signs indicate that all is not well. They spend the night together, but while Geraldine undresses, she shows a terrible but undefined mark. When Lord Byron read the poem aloud at Villa Diodati to the Shelleys, Claire Clairmont, and Dr. Polidori in 1816, this imagery caused Percy Shelley to scream. In the narrative, Christabel's father, Sir Leoline, becomes enthralled with Geraldine and orders a grand procession to announce her rescue. He ignores the weak objections of his daughter, who, although under enchantment, is starting to realize the enormity of Geraldine's malign nature. The unfinished poem ends here. Alas, Samuel could not finish. He feared the poet was dead in him, even when the world told him otherwise. At the top of Skiddaw, by a little shed of slate stones on which Samuel had scribbled his name among the others, a lean, expressive-faced man had come up the hill and stood next to him. Looking at the names, he exclaimed, "Coleridge, I lay my life, that is the poet Coleridge." In 1801, Samuel wrote Godwin that,
"The poet is dead in me. My imagination lies like the cold snuff on the circular rim of a brass candlestick, without even a stink of tallow to remind you that it was once clothed and mitred with flame. That is passed by."
Samuel failed to see the evidence in this letter that his powers were alive and well. At the time, he felt overshadowed by Wordsworth. Opium, marital unhappiness, and an unconsummated love for Sara Hutchinson made 1801 a year in which he published almost nothing. He spent the last days of 1801 back in London writing for the Morning Post, attending Humphrey Davy's lectures on chemistry at the Royal Institution, and making social calls to William Godwin, who had just married his second wife, Mrs. Claremont. Samuel's slump culminated in the poem Dejection, an Ode, which appeared in the Morning Post on October 4th, 1802, the day of his 7th wedding anniversary and the day of Wordsworth's actual wedding. In August, Samuel, alone, went on a 9-day walk around the Lake District, which took him to the top of Scafell, the second highest peak in England. When he found himself on a dangerously narrow ledge on one leg of the journey, he wrote,
"God!" I exclaimed aloud. "How calm, how blessed am I now! I know not how to proceed, how to return, but I am calm and fearless and confident. If this reality were a dream, if I were asleep, what agonies had I suffered? What screams? When the reason and the will are away, what remains to us but darkness and dimness and a bewildering shame and pain that is utterly lord over us, or fantastic pleasure that draws the soul along swimming through the air in many shapes, even as a flight of starlings in a wind?"
Samuel repaired his relations with his brother George in a letter, expressing that he was angling back towards Anglicanism from Unitarianism, reasoning the latter as too rational and optimistic. There was a hidden motive for Samuel's letter to George. Should Samuel die of gout or some other illness, George could arrange help for the again pregnant Sara. When she gave birth to a daughter, also named Sara, Samuel was away in Wales with Tom Wedgwood, planning a trip to Italy. He immediately came home to Keswick, but was not reconciled to stay. Now 30 years old, Samuel's underlying restlessness of spirit, his refusal to take responsibility, his misery about the two Saras, his health, and his opium habit compelled him to wander. Southey moved into Greta Hall with the Coleridges, and Samuel went on a walking tour of Scotland with Wordsworth and Dorothy. Before leaving, Samuel acted as godfather to Wordsworth's son, John, and Wordsworth played host to William Hazlitt. Samuel described Hazlitt's manners as brow-hanging, shoe-contemplative, strange, but noted that his opinions were original. He sends well-headed and well-feathered thoughts straight forwards to the mark, with a twang of the bowstring. He also noted that Hazlitt was addicted to women as objects of sexual indulgence. On one occasion, Hazlitt grossly misread the intentions of one local woman and made his overture too forward. The incident caused an altercation, forcing Hazlitt to skip town under cover of darkness, saved by Samuel and Wordsworth. After the walking tour, Samuel travelled to Malta, a trip that took 6 weeks and gave him bouts of seasickness and constipation, in addition to his pain of opium withdrawal and his cravings for it. There was also the recurring nightmare of Wordsworth's wife dying, and Wordsworth marrying his wife's sister, Sara Hutchinson, looming in his unconscious. In Malta, Samuel was a guest of his friend John Stoddart, the advocate of the Crown and of the Admiralty at Malta. Mrs. Stoddart gave birth a week later to a daughter that died shortly thereafter, and found Mr. Coleridge an imposition. Samuel got to know Sir Alexander Ball, the governor of Malta, and moved into the governor's palace, becoming public secretary in 1805. Samuel also visited Sicily and climbed Mount Etna. He wrote letters home, but had developed the bad habit of not opening replies for fear they'd contain bad news, afraid that one of the children might have died. Thus, in order to avoid immediate pain, he kept himself in an agony of suspense. In March, he met Lady Ball in her drawing room, where she broke the news that John Wordsworth, William's brother and captain of the Earl of Abergavenny, had gone down with his ship and 300 men.
I was nearly strangled,
said Coleridge. In September, the replacement secretary had arrived, and in December, Samuel set out for Rome. He met several artists and their patrons and dallied in Rome for some time. French troops were expected in 4 days, and as a recent employee of the British government, he'd be in danger of arrest, but he decided to remain. The American painter, Washington Allston, did his portrait. In May, an order was issued by Napoleon to expel British citizens from papal territory. Samuel left, having no literature to show for his entire trip, but the scribblings in his notebooks. He was on a lengthy sea voyage and filled with inner despair and anxiety about the state of his children. Samuel had truly become his ancient mariner. By August, he was back in England. No record survives of his reaction towards seeing his family, but of Sara, he told the Wordsworths he was determined to part with her absolutely and finally. On a trip to see the Wordsworths, Samuel brought Hartley along to Cole Orton. At a break in the coach journey, Hartley ran away. According to Coleridge,
I was out 5 minutes seeking him in great alarm, and found him at the further end of a wet meadow on the marge of a river. After dinner, fearful of losing our places by the window of the long coach, I ordered him to go into the coach and sit in the place where he was before, and I would follow. In about 5 minutes, I followed. No Hartley. halloing, in vain. At length, where should I discover him? In the same meadow, only at a greater distance, and close down on the very edge of the water. I was angry from downright fright. And what, think you, was Cataphract's excuse? It was misunderstanding, father. I thought, you see, that you bid me go to the very same place in the meadow, where I was.
Samuel and Hartley stayed with the Wordsworths for 2 years. The first thing to be done was for Samuel to hear William's new poem, called Poem, titled Not Yet Fixed Upon, to Coleridge. It would become The Prelude, unpublished until 1850. It was 13 books long, or about 250 pages, and autobiographical. Samuel praised the poem, while feeling himself a failure. Humphrey Davy got Samuel a commission to give a course of 25 lectures on Shakespeare and Milton at the Royal Institution for £140. Samuel completed 20 lectures, given extempore, charming his audiences and also irritating them with repetitions and unfulfilled promises. He started a new periodical called The Friend, which provoked a similar reaction. Unlike The Watchman, it was not to deal with current affairs, but concern itself to founding true principles to oppose false principles in legislation, philosophy, morals, and international law. His demographic wasn't the general population, but those who were influencers of men. The Friend ran from June 1809 to March 1810. Hazlitt described it like this.
What is The Friend itself but an enormous title page? The longest and most tiresome prospectus that ever was written, an endless preface to an imaginary work, a table of contents that fills the whole volume, a huge bill of fares of all possible subjects. One number consists of a grave-faced promise to perform something impossible in the next, and the next is taken up with a long-faced apology for not having done it.
Southey was just glad
To get some part of what is in him out of him in any way.
Dorothy wrote of Coleridge,
We have no hope of him, none that he will ever do anything more than he has already done. If he were not under our roof, he would be just as much the slave of stimulants as ever. He lies in bed, always till after 12 o'clock, and never walks out. Even the finest spring day does not tempt him to seek the fresh air, and this beautiful valley seems a blank to him. Sometimes he does not speak a word, and when he does talk, it is always very much upon subjects as far aloof from himself or his friends as possible.
In October 1810, Samuel left Keswick for London in the company of a friend of Wordsworth's named Basil Montague. Montague told Samuel how the Wordsworths really felt and said that William had no hope of him. The effect was shattering. Samuel was now so sensitive to criticism that a careless word dropped by Montague made a mountain out of a molehill. Samuel stopped writing to Wordsworth. William was so used to long periods of silence from his friend that he didn't suspect anything amiss for a year. In 1810 and 1811, Samuel gravitated around London, primarily staying at his friend John Morgan's house in Hammersmith, and met often with Lamb and Godwin. In a conversation with his lawyer friend, Henry Crabb Robinson, Samuel explained to him the distinction between imagination and fancy.
Fancy is the arbitrary bringing together of things that lie remote and forming them into a unity. The materials lie ready for the fancy, which acts as a sort of juxtaposition. On the other hand, imagination, under some excitement, generates and produces a form of its own.
Robinson helped Samuel arrange a new set of 15 lectures, given at the London Philosophical Society's rooms off Fleet Street. Topics ranged from analysing Shakespeare's characters to comparison between Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Attendance was good and included poets Lord Byron and Samuel Rogers. Coleridge urged his critics to apply principles and form a rubric when critiquing literature, singling out the Edinburgh Review. the same one Byron targeted in his satire, English bards and Scotch reviewers, written in revenge for the drubbing his first volume of poetry had received. When the lectures were over, Samuel wrote Sara that he was coming north on the Liverpool Mail. Waiting for him at Keswick was a young poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had been staying in local lodgings, eager to meet him. Shelley met Coleridge's family instead. He found Mrs. Southey stupid and Mrs. Coleridge worse. Samuel had arrived too late. Southey, however, upon meeting Shelley, wrote that the experience was like meeting his own ghost.
He is just what I was in 1794. His name is Shelley, son to the member from Shoreham, with £6,000 a year entailed upon him, and as much more in his father's power to cut off. Beginning with romances of ghost and murder, and with poetry at Eton, he passed at Oxford into metaphysics, printed half a dozen pages which he entitled The Necessity of Atheism, sent one anonymously to Coppleston, in expectation, I suppose, of converting him, was expelled in consequence, married a girl of 17 after being turned out of doors by his father, and here they both are in lodgings, living upon £200 a year which her father allows them.
Once back in London, Wordsworth came to discuss the Montague affair to try and mend the quarrel, with Lamb and Robinson acting as intermediaries. Coleridge was very sensitive, and Wordsworth very proud, but the breach was healed with Samuel writing to William that,
"Whatever be the result of this long-delayed explanation, I have loved you and yours too long and too deeply to have it in my power to cease to do so."
The pair walked together to Hampstead as a sign of renewed friendship. On May the 11th, 1812, Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was murdered in the House of Commons, an event that left Samuel shaken and delayed his next series of lectures. Topics included German philosopher Friedrich Schlegel's material on ancient and modern drama. Wordsworth was in attendance. Bad news came when, due to business losses, Josiah Wedgwood could no longer pay his half of the £150 annuity to Samuel, but would continue to pay Tom's half, Thomas having died in 1805. As luck would have it, Drury Lane had accepted Coleridge's Osorio for £400. Renamed Remorse, the show ran for 20 nights in 1813, a successful run for the time. One reason for the success was because Remorse was a Shakespearean tragedy, and there were very few dramas being written and worthy of staging. The play was more poetic than dramatic and earned friendly reviews. Samuel then gave lectures in Bristol on Milton and Cervantes, in between instances of contemplating suicide. Sara Coleridge was resentful of Samuel and jealous of his friends. Wordsworth had been appointed as distributor of stamps for Westmoreland at £400 a year, and Southey was made poet laureate. Samuel continued avoiding her. His son Hartley was also neglected, leaving Southey and Wordsworth to arrange the boys' college and expenses. They gathered money together from the Coleridges in Ottery, Poole, Montague, and Cottle, and the eccentric Hartley was able to matriculate at Merton College, Oxford, dropped off personally by Wordsworth and Lamb. In June 1815, while Samuel struggled with making money and his dependency on opium, Britain celebrated the victory at Waterloo. A bonfire was lit on the top of Skiddaw, where the Wordsworths and Southey attended. Samuel had written Lord Byron, asking him to use his influence to find a publisher. Byron was as good as his word. He spoke to John Murray at the firm of Rest Fenner, and Samuel brought out a slim volume of poetry in 1816. This book contained Christabel, Kubla Khan, and The Pains of Sleep. Byron had urged Samuel to finish part 3 of Christabel, but Samuel couldn't bring himself into the right state of mind to do so. Byron also gifted Samuel £100. Critics were harsh. The biggest culprit was William Hazlitt, who had a vendetta against Coleridge and Wordsworth ever since they saved him after his misconduct in Keswick. Byron said of the reviews that Coleridge was extremely badly served. Samuel confided to Byron that he had a daily habit of taking enormous doses of laudanum. To deal with his addiction, Samuel approached an apothecary surgeon in Highgate named James Gilman and asked him to be taken into his home as a paying guest for a month so that his opium intake could be medically supervised. Samuel asked Gilman to refuse his requests for this detested poison and to outwit any attempts he knew he would make to evade constraint, knowing that he had the cunning of a specific madness. Samuel moved into Highgate with the Gilmans and stayed there for the rest of his life. In 1817, Samuel published the volume Sibylline Leaves, a collection of his previous poetry, through Rest Fenner. In July came the prose work Biographia Literaria, part autobiography, part literary criticism, and everything in between. The composition had begun in 1815 by Samuel dictating the words to Morgan while staying in Caen, with the first of 2 volumes released in 1817. Early chapters emphasized the need for philosophical criticism, sprinkled in with anecdotes from his school days. In Chapter 10, he digresses from metaphysical discussions to give a humorous, bitter account of his attempts to raise subscriptions for The Friend and The Watchman, and shares the story when he and Wordsworth were spied upon. Coleridge argues against the prevailing skeptical, materialist utilitarian philosophy from Locke, Hume, Hartley, Voltaire, and Condillac, and argues for a reasoned faith in God. In other words, the Enlightenment put man before God, when God should come before man. The tome also includes the Kantian difference between fancy and imagination, and its relation to reason. In chapters 12 and 13, Coleridge borrowed heavily from German philosopher Friedrich Schelling for his argument on subject and object, mind and nature. Instead of properly crediting those whose ideas came before him, Coleridge preempts any criticism by stating that the truth was
a divine ventriloquist. I care not from whose mouth the sounds are supposed to proceed, if only the words are audible and intelligible.
Coleridge reserved Chapter 17 for the discussion of Wordsworth's poetry. One of Coleridge's insights into poetic genius in general reads like this.
Like the moisture or the polish of a pebble, genius neither distorts nor false colours its objects, but on the contrary, brings out many a vein and many a tint, which escape the eye of common observation, thus raising to the rank of gems what had been often kicked away by the hurrying foot of the traveller on the dusty highroad of custom.
Wordsworth skimmed it and found the praise too extravagant and the censure inconsiderate. It was noted by Robinson and Hazlitt that this was typical of Wordsworth. He was unable to forgive a single censure, mingled with however great a massive eulogy. At a party given by Tom Monkhouse, Samuel spoke of painting in mystical terms, while Wordsworth countered in dry, unfeeling contradiction. At another party at Lamb's house, guests gathered around Samuel and Wordsworth in 2 circles, with Samuel having the larger group. Robinson heard Samuel quoting Wordsworth and heard Wordsworth quoting Wordsworth. In spite of Wordsworth's pomp, he did read Biographia Literaria because he revised his poems, The Thorn and Immortality Ode, based on Coleridge's objections to them. Reviewers found Biographia convoluted and tangential, but the work was a great influence to later critics of the Victorian age and the early 20th century. Samuel was nicknamed the Sage of Highgate, where he received visitors and gave another series of lectures on Shakespeare, recorded by one of Gilman's fellow surgeons, J.H. Green, the matter of which was published in 1865 as Spiritual Philosophy, founded on the teaching of the late Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In 1818, Samuel read William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, first published in 1795, and wrote of his impression.
I have this morning been reading a strange publication, viz. Poems with very wild and interesting pictures, printed and painted by the author W. Blake. He is a man of genius, and I apprehend a Swedenborgian, certainly a mystic emphatically. You perhaps smile at my calling another poet a mystic, but verily I am in the very mire of commonplace common sense compared with Mr. Blake, apo or rather anacalyptic poet and painter.
By a friend, Wilkie Collins, Samuel received a painting of his 16-year-old daughter Sara Coleridge, whom he had not seen for 6 years. He said,
"It is the most beautiful fancy figure I ever saw,"
and hung it on his wall in Highgate. In April 1819, Samuel was approached by a young admirer that later wrote of the encounter.
Last Sunday, I took a walk towards Highgate, and in the lane that winds by the side of Lord Mansfield Park, I met Mr. Green, our demonstrator, in conversation with Coleridge. I joined them, after inquiring by a look whether it would be agreeable. I walked with him at his alderman after dinner pace for nearly 2 miles, I suppose. In those 2 miles, he broached 1,000 things. Let me see if I can give you a list. Nightingales, poetry, unpoetical sensation, metaphysics, different genera and species of dreams, nightmare, a dream accompanied by a sense of touch, single and double touch, a dream related, first and second consciousness, the difference explained between will and volition, monsters, the kraken, mermaids, a ghost story. I heard his voice as he came towards me. I heard it as he moved away. I had heard it all the interval, if it may be called so. He was civil enough to ask me to call on him at Highgate.
The admirer was John Keats. In contrast, Samuel had now fallen in Byron's eyes. In Don Juan, Byron wrote the lines,
"And Coleridge too has lately taken wing, but like a hawk encumbered with his hood, explaining metaphysics to the nation, I wish he would explain his explanation.
and
Thou shalt believe in Milton, Dryden, Pope. Thou shalt not set up Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, because the first is crazed beyond all hope, the second drunk, the third so quaint and mouthy."
Samuel replied to him by letter.
My lord, that I should be selected by you to share such immortality as time may confer upon your Don Juan demands my acknowledgement, the quality of which is enlarged by the charge of inebriety you prefer against me. The sobriety of this letter is the unhappy proof of the extravagance of your praise.
Byron wrote that the reason for the attack stemmed from a rumour that
Shelley and I were in a league of incest. Master Southey is a burning liar, for the women to whom he alludes are not sisters, Mary Shelley and Claire Clairmont, and there was no promiscuous intercourse whatever. Further, I understand Coleridge went about repeating Southey's lie with pleasure. I can believe it, for I had done him what is called a favour.
Byron was misinformed. It was not Southey who started the rumour, but Henry Broome, the same man who criticised Byron's early poetry in the Edinburgh Review. Whereas Samuel was unable to arrange Hartley's schooling, he was in a better place mentally to set up Derwent at Cambridge, with London friend John Hookham Frere as Derwent's chief benefactor. In April 1820, Samuel met Derwent at Highgate, a son he had not seen in 8 years. By May 1820, the fellowship Hartley received at Oriel College was not renewed due to his irregular hours and frequently coming home intoxicated. Samuel and Sara Coleridge suffered a great shock. To Samuel's credit, though, he did not blame Hartley. Samuel blamed himself. Hartley turned up in London in August and stayed with the Montagues. Samuel did his best to reverse the decision, but the provost wouldn't budge, instead offering £300 as recompense. In the meantime, another ghost from the past had arrived in London, Samuel's older brother and surrogate father, George, drudging up memories of how George was there for him when he'd run away from Cambridge. The brothers had not met for 24 years. As opposed to the stormy relations Samuel had with Hartley and Derwent, he acted more fatherly to his young friend Thomas Alsop by giving fatherly life advice. Daughter Sara Coleridge, now 19, surprised her parents when she translated Martin de Brothoffer's account of Abipones, an equestrian people of Paraguay, from Latin into English for John Murray to publish. Ironically, she got favourable reviews in the Quarterly Review when her father could not. In January 1823, Sara arrived in Highgate to see her father for the first time in 9 years and, with her beauty and brains, took literary London by storm. Sara had a nervous disposition, like Samuel, and would suffer many breakdowns after the births of her children from 1830 on. To cope, she would resort to opium and become dependent on the drug. But presently in Highgate, she was meeting her cousin, Henry Nelson Coleridge, for the first time and fell in love. Samuel and his brother Colonel James were against first cousins marrying, but the couple could not be dissuaded. After Henry waited 6 years to establish his legal career, he wed Sara in 1824, with the blessings of both fathers. Henry became his Uncle Sam's loudest champion. Henry took detailed notes of Samuel's conversations and published them in 1835 as Table Talk. Praise slowly forthcoming from critics like John Gibson Lockhart, Leigh Hunt, and even Hazlitt. In May 1825, Coleridge published Aids to Reflection, a work he hoped would be a moral guide to young men, while securing his own reputation as something more than a dreamer and a talker. Aids of Reflection was widely ignored by reviewers, but maybe the book wasn't written for them. It was for men who viewed it as a spiritual guide, men like Greene, Gilman, Alsop, and Tulk. James Marsh, president of the University of Vermont, brought out an American edition in 1829, making Coleridge a guru in American universities. Hartley had become a teacher in Ambleside, but by October 1825, the school had failed, so he turned to drink. He drank, despaired, and drank some more, occasionally turning in magazine work for money while wandering the north. After 1822, Hartley never wrote his father again. He slept in barns and inns, drinking often on credit. Wordsworth would pay his bills and took him in whenever Hartley was in Grasmere. In April 1828, Samuel dined with Sir Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper at William Sotheby's house. Cooper described the two literary lions, Coleridge giving an exhibition more extraordinary than anything Cooper had ever witnessed. Not a discourse, but a dissertation, which he continued for more than an hour without interruption. Scott sat immovable as a statue. Of the evening, Scott later wrote in his journal that
Lockhart and I dined with Sotheby, where we met a large dining party, the orator of which was that extraordinary man Coleridge. After eating a hearty dinner, during which he spoke not a word, he began a most learned harangue on the Samothracian mysteries. Zounds! I was never so bethumped with words.
Wordsworth attended a breakfast with Samuel shortly thereafter and proposed one more adventure, a tour of Belgium, Holland, and the Rhineland with he and his daughter Dora. Samuel was happy to oblige. They spent some time at Mrs. Adder's at her summer home at Godesberg on the Rhine. Mrs. Adders wrote to her husband that she was delighted with Wordsworth, but still claimed Coleridge as her poet. Samuel had eclipsed Wordsworth in Brussels too. A resident Englishman, T.C. Grattan, recorded their meeting, describing how Coleridge looked like a handsome-faced itinerant preacher whose speech was a wonderful attraction. By contrast, Wordsworth did not talk well and reminded him of a mountain farmer. Overall, the tour was a success. Wordsworth and Dora gave no sign of tensions, But a single entry in Samuel's notebook suggests his old resentment was alive under his peaceful demeanour. It bursts into vitriolic life in an outraged comment written in German that he had
never on earth known such hard, rigid, continual, in all points despotic egotism.
In December 1829, On the Constitution of Church and State was published by Hurst, Chance and Company, containing the fruits of Coleridge's thinking for the past 30 years about the Church of England and its relation to the state. Of the recent Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, Coleridge said he would vote for the admission of lay Catholics not only to both houses of the legislature, but to all other offices below the Crown, on the condition that the Catholic priesthood would not enjoy any national wealth set aside for the national church. The book, published in 2 volumes, received good reviews. If you want to benefit from the undoubted wisdom of Coleridge, many reviewers seem to say you must put up with his idiosyncratic, roundabout way of expressing it. Samuel remained vigorous in mind, though was constantly ill. He had missed his daughter Sara's wedding in 1829, but in 1832 he roused himself to go to Hampstead for the christening of her second child, Edith. In 1833, Samuel also found himself well enough to visit Cambridge. Derwent was surprised and gratified at the unexpected arrival of his father, who received a flattering reception. Back in Highgate, Samuel was visited by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Samuel burst into a declamation on the folly and ignorance of Unitarianism. Emerson, Unitarian himself, refused to be offended and recognized Coleridge's hunger for ideas, and also recognized that he wrote and spoke the only high criticism in his time. In March 1834, Samuel was suffering from a tumour in his cheek and neck and another outbreak of erysipelas. 3 volumes of his poetical works appeared, edited by Henry, to a chorus of critical approval. Wordsworth and Coleridge had finally succeeded in creating the taste by which their poetry was to be enjoyed. Sara Hutchinson paid Samuel a visit and was alarmed by the changed appearance of her dear old friend. In July, a Mrs. Dashwood wrote out of the blue to Mrs. Gilman, expressing her admiration for Coleridge's genius and offered him an annuity. Samuel graciously accepted, but it was too late for annuities. On July the 25th, 1834, after a lifetime of suffering, Samuel Coleridge died. Sara Hutchinson died a year later, worn out from taking care of Dorothy, who'd suffered from early dementia, and worn out from helping Southey, whose wife was committed to a lunatic asylum. Coleridge was buried in Highgate, in a vault next to Highgate School, on August 2nd, 1834. The school built a new chapel which extended over the graveyard, and the Coleridge family vault was neglected. In 1961, Coleridge's remains were moved to St. Michael's Church. Wordsworth had once said that,
"Many men have done wonderful things, Newton, Davy, etc. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge is the only wonderful man I ever knew."